In this webinar we're going to see how to set up an MPSTOR cloud. Step 1 is to download the code from the MPSTOR website, navigate and unzip it to a directory and then run the Windows installer. That Windows installer will format whatever USB key you've plugged into your system and erase all the partitions and the data on it. And once the USB key has been partitioned, it will copy all of the MPSTOR software onto that USB key, and then that USB key can be used to boot a bare-bones system. So once the copying of all the files has been completed, and that can take a few minutes, before you plug out the key, simply navigate to the USB key directory and configure a very important file called soma.cfg, and in that file we need to set what is the base IP address of the machine that we're going to configure in the next step. So in our case it's 10.0.10.150, and we will be able to access the setup GUI at that IP address in the next step. You can set up a gateway at this stage, or you can wait until the next step to set up the gateway. Same thing for a DNS server, and of course, since we're going to set the IP address, make sure that the DHCP is equal to false. If you have multiple MPSTOR clouds set up, then you do need to set what's known as the proviso zone to something different for every one of your clouds. Once that's done, you can proceed to the to booting your machine. Plug the USB key into your bare-bones machine and boot it, and you will then be able to access the setup GUI. So in this setup GUI, first step is just to verify that all of the disks you have installed in the system are visible. We're going to create a OS RAID. So this is a RAID that we're going to install the OpenStack or the cloud operating system onto. So I'm just going to create a 2-disk RAID 0. Obviously in a production system you'd want to use a RAID 6 or a RAID 5 or something like that, or a RAID 10. Then I need to create 2 volumes. One volume is going to be used by the OpenStack service itself. So in this case I've taken about half the space, 250 gigs for that. I'm going to allocate space for that volume on that RAID I've just created, and most importantly I'm going to export it by clicking the export and OpenStack service to the OpenStack. That volume will now be used by the OpenStack service to create all of the services used by the cloud. The next step is to create a separate volume for the image repository, and this is the volume that we're going to store all of the virtual machine images on, and both the base images and any backups that we may make. So follow the same procedure, create about half the space, 250 gigs, and this time we export it to the glance service, which is the image management service. Once that volume has then been created, we simply go to the next step, which is to set up the OpenStack service itself. And here we just click on all, since this is an all-in-one configuration, we'll click on all of those services that we need to start an all-in-one service and map all of the services to different Ethernet ports. In our case we just have one Ethernet port, so we'll put them all on the same port, set out all of the basic passwords and for all of the services, and finally at the very end of going through this setup phase we simply finish our setup and start the cloud services. So this, to start the cloud services, this will take a few minutes. It takes about 2 minutes from start to finish to configure or to do the GUI setup, but then it takes about 4 to 5 minutes for the entire cloud to boot, for all of the services to boot. So during that period of time, the screen, or the setup screen, will just show you all of the services that are starting. These are all of the services that are required for the cloud to function. So simply just wait and note all of the services in your own cloud you should see all of the services starting. If you look up at the timestamp or the clock up on the right hand corner of the screen, you can see that for example for the Keystone it's taken now about 5.5 minutes to get the Keystone service to that point, and once the Keystone service is set up, the last services, Nova, Compute, Cinder, etc. usually set up fairly quickly. So all in all, it takes 2.5 minutes to actually configure the cloud, and then it takes about another 5 minutes to boot the entire cloud. And once that's done, we can then move to the next step. Uploading the images to Glance is uploading a number of virtual machine images that you can start using straight after the cloud is functional. So Orkestra is now running, so that's taken about 5 minutes to boot the cloud, and we can verify that it's running by just looking at the boot log, and we can see at the very end of the boot log that everything has booted and finished. So the next step then is to before we start using the cloud, is we want to set up a volume or a RAID that we're going to use to provision volumes on for our virtual machines. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a filter function to pick all of the disks that have not been used, so the ones that are free, and we're going to set the QoS of those free disks to a different QoS than we used for the previous RAID. We're going to call this business QoS, and this will just allow us, as we'll see when we set up the software-defined storage controller, to provision volumes only from this particular RAID. So once we've set up the disk QoSs, we can then create a RAID, and here we're going to set the QoS to be business, so we will only see those disks that correspond to that QoS. Once that RAID has been built, we can then use that RAID in our software-defined storage controller. So the next step then is to launch the software-defined storage controller, and we're going to create some compute groups and storage groups. This isn't strictly necessary, however, it's to illustrate the use of how groups work within the cloud controller. So simply click on the node manager, and the first thing that we have to configure is a policy, and a policy is used every time we provision a volume within the cloud. The volume will be provisioned according to this policy. So you see we'll select business as the media tier, and that means we're going to provision off any RAID which is of class business. So once we have a policy created, we can then create storage groups. So to create a storage group, it's simply add, give the storage group a name. In this particular case, we'll use the name default, and the namespace can be default.something.something to create multiple different types of namespaces. We'll create a compute group. We'll call this compute group standard. We can create an arbitrary number of compute groups and storage groups and launch our virtual machines and provision our storage from those compute groups. Now I simply link the compute group with the storage group, and for every compute group and storage group, I'm going to put some hardware resources into those groups. I do that by simply selecting the node I want to put into the group and clicking the link button. When I've set up my compute groups and storage groups, I can log in to my cloud controller again at the base IP address of 10.0.10.150. Simply put in the name admin and whatever name we've configured when we set up the system, and to launch an instance, click on the launch button, and we'll now see that there have been some images pre-installed in the system. We'll give an instance name of test, and now I can pick my compute group here, and I'm going to pick standard. If I created multiple compute groups, I could choose within which compute group to launch my virtual machine. That would correspond to different clusters of hardware. There are other options such as volume options and post creation options. We're not going to look at that in this webinar, therefore more advanced usage. But simply launch your VM, and your VM will be launched, go through the various steps, and it'll finally be up and running. The next step then is to create a volume. So simply pick, again, we pick the default group that we're going to create the volume in, and that would correspond to different clusters of storage nodes, and any provisioning now will be done according to that storage policy that we set up for the default group. So once the volume has been created, we can then attach it. We're going to attach it now to our instance that we set up, and don't forget to set up the /dev device that it will be attached to. In our case, we're going to be /vdb. Now our volume has been attached to our virtual machine, and all that's been achieved within 10 minutes of actually installing the system.